Thanks, Deneen. And good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending, Mayor Alty and Councillors Administration. Appreciate you taking the time to meet with us today. I understand that our submission on the budget has been circulated to you. Hope you've had a chance to read it. That was the subject and the product of some good and hearty debate amongst the board. And so we put a lot of thought into that. And so we're looking forward to discussing it with you along with the budget this afternoon. And also looking forward, I acknowledge the collaborative relationship that the YK Chamber and the City of Yellowknife have had, and we look forward to continuing with that. That's, again, the product of some hard work. Deneen and Sheila, Mayor Alty in particular, you guys I know work really closely together, so thanks for that. And looking forward to getting into some budget stuff. So thanks very much. I'll pass it back to Deneen to do some intros.
Great, thanks, Tim. So before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to introduce the board members that we have on the call with us today. I'd like to recognize Adrian Bell with Century 21 Prospect Realty. I'd like to recognize our second Vice President, Rob Warburton with Cloudworks, Paul Bitsina with Dead on Show Management, and Melanie White with Boa Wee Catering. I also see someone here, CFS, and I'm not sure who that is, if that's council or from our board. Anyway, we will hand it over to the City of Yellowknife for some introductions.
Thanks, Deneen. So joining us today, we have Councillor Morris and Councillor Williams, and myself, Mayor Alty, of course. And then from administration, we have Sheila Bassi-Kellett, who's the city's SAO, Senior Administrative Officer, and we have Sherilyn Woodward, who is the Director of Corporate Services, as well as Carrie Penny, who is the Director of Economic Development. So thanks again for the letter, as well as for hosting today's meeting.
Great, thank you. On that note, I thought we would get things started by acknowledging in our letter, we understood the proposed property tax increase that council would be debating to be 11.92%, which we now understand has been reduced down to 4.26% because of territorial government support. So a little over 1.5 million came from the territorial government in COVID relief funding, and 855,000 toward addressing the municipal funding gap. So maybe I'll hand it over to you, Mayor Alty, to see if you want to elaborate on that a bit.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, as mentioned, when we launched our budget on November 2nd, we hadn't received confirmation, or the GNWT hadn't voted on these supplementary funding bills. And so during that week, that was their last week of session, and they did approve two funding pots, one for COVID relief and one to address the municipal funding gap. So we've received verbal notice that this will be the amount of funding we'll receive, but we're still waiting for the contribution agreements to be able to finalize the details, but this is what we're anticipating.
Great.
And to mention that 855,000 is ongoing funding, so we'll be getting that bump up this year as well as years to come. So that's great news and greatly appreciated.
Hey, Rebecca, I'm just curious, would we have to wait till February for that to get officially voted on, or is that set in stone?
Oh, no, this one's separate. So there's also, after the territorial government also was going to put in their own 2.5 million. No, sorry, they're going to do a supplementary in February to approve 2.5 million for capital. So we won't know about that. So that extra funding will be more towards our 2022 budget, but we'll receive notice well in advance of, or we should hopefully, well in advance of our 2022 budget.
Great, thank you. So I wanted to open it up then for questions from council regarding the submission that we made. I've included the submission in the chat box, and it's also included on our website, ykchamber.com. But we wanted to just have an opportunity for councillors to ask questions to our board of directors, and then I'm sure our board members will have some questions for council as well.
Okay, thanks, Deneen. Yeah, I had a few questions related to this. So you guys did talk about the mill rate ratios, and have you done any analysis on what the overall net savings would be for a business if the city were to reduce property taxes? Because right now that has an impact on territorial and federal taxes, because property taxes get to be considered an expense, and therefore a business would have more revenue, so they would be taxed at those other levels differently. So just wondering if your board has done that analysis to see what the net savings would be if the municipality lowered their property tax, whether it would just kind of be a wash because they would have the increase at the federal or territorial level.
We have not done that analysis among our board of directors, but I'm wondering if any board members have individually. I don't know if anyone has anything to add or comment.
Rob here. So generally taxes, like most businesses don't own their building, they're owned by a landlord like myself. Taxes are in an O&M budget, which is usually charged and dispersed among tenants quarterly or yearly, depending on the lease. So if the taxes go down, most leases in town, the actual out-of-pocket for that business would go down quite like directly. So because they're tied almost, a lot of leases are tied dollar for dollar. I'm generalizing a lot here, but in general, that would be how it works. So it's an O&M thing. So it would be, that's easier to pass along to businesses in a building than say if it was a cost.
But then when they would have that decrease in O&M, that would have an increase in their revenue opportunities. So then they would be charged. So just wondering if there's been an analysis on that decrease in O&M, or so the territorial and federal tax increase that could accompany that.
I can speak to that just briefly, Adrian. Just give me one sec. I think what the question you're at, no, we haven't done the analysis because I'm not sure that it would generate really valuable data. If basically the property tax, whether it's through a lease or directly paid by an owner, is an expense. And so I think what you're suggesting is that if the expense were reduced by $100 a year, then that $100 would sit there and just be taxed by some other government, whether it's territorial or, but that's not necessarily true. If there's $100 less in expenses in one column, then it can be an expense in another column, like say hiring another employee or purchasing a capital asset or maintaining a capital asset. So I don't really see the relation there. I would be interested to know if that's an analysis that other municipalities are doing when they're considering lowering property taxes. But I don't see how that is really all that germane, because I don't think that's just going to be scooped.
Yeah, no, gotcha. Point taken there. The other one I had was on the small business property tax. So I did take a look at Bonnyville's tax bylaw and their subclass there. And so it talks about 50 or more full-time employees across Canada. So, and then their property taxes could go down. So instead of paying 100%, they'd be paying 75%. So that 25% difference would have to be absorbed by another business or residents. So I think of, McDonald's wouldn't be eligible for that. So they could see their property tax increase, but Copper House would be eligible. So they would see their property decrease. Or like Mermaid Moon would be eligible, but Bijou Boutique wouldn't be eligible. So there would be some businesses that would be seeing their property tax go up and some people would be seeing it go down. So just wondering if the chamber, that's what was intended, or if there's been any review on that?
Yeah, I think the key message is really that, we want the city of Yellowknife to explore opportunities to reduce the tax burden on small businesses. The models that we referenced are just examples of other folks, municipalities who are doing it, and circumstances that fit for their community. We want to see, one option could also be, that we mention is reducing that small business tax altogether. Perhaps I'll hand this over to my board, as I know this suggestion came from them as well. Adrian, I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add?
For sure. Thanks for the question, Rebecca. And I think this, it does require a little bit of background, and I don't have the spreadsheet in front of me, but as you know, from the graph that's been presented to council in the past, the mill rates were slowly increased about 4 or 5 times in the last 20 years on the business sector, not just the small business sector, but big business, and also on, I think, government buildings probably. So there has been, that burden has been increasing on the business community, and that's very, very profitable for the city because you've got things like the hospital, and you've got the REITs, the new hospital, I should point out, and the REITs that have all this infrastructure downtown that is generating a lot of tax revenue. And I think in the last 3 years, taxation has increased by 26% in the city. And it's not because the tax rate has increased, but it's because you've had such amazing assessment growth. And so when you take a look at that and you see just how much more tax revenue is coming in and how much your reserve funds are building up each year, it provides you with an opportunity to consider strategically how you want to tax different sectors. And in some other cities, they take a look at the small business sector and they say, look, these increases, not just the annual increases that everybody gets, but the ones that small businesses have gotten over and above everybody else. Eventually it becomes very difficult. It squeezes business margins. And at the end of the day, eventually you end up with only these huge franchises from the South who have these lower costs and these really advanced business models. They're the only ones who can really survive when you've increased taxation on small businesses, and not just taxation, obviously, but other costs as well. So it just makes it very difficult. So a lot of municipalities will take a look at the small business sector and say, look, we have, I don't want to say unfairly because it was done strategically and the fairness was taken into consideration, but we have increased taxation on the small business sector more than on residents over the last 20 years. And this council did as well in its first budget after the latest general assessment. And the justification at the time was, well, we don't want sticker shock for residents. But in a year when there's a 0% tax increase, there is no sticker shock. And that's probably something that's achievable this year. It has been achieved in the past. Maybe not always a good precedent to set, but it's doable. And that way you could say, well, going forward, what's going to happen? We're not necessarily going to take money from residents and give it to businesses here. That's not what's happening. We're just going to make sure that future increases are applied a little more fairly across the sectors. And it's up to council to decide what that fairness level is. In the past, the fairness has disadvantaged small businesses. And, reserve funds have been built up and taxation has grown. And now we're at this point where, it seems like there's a lot of money socked away for a rainy day. And when business owners look outside their windows, it's raining pretty hard right now. So this is an opportunity to kind of undo some of those past decisions. And I don't know if you've all had the conversation about how these increases started, but it does date back to when the gold mines shut down and the city, and this is back in the 90s, and the city was faced with a huge loss of a huge, call it an anchor tenant that paid a lot of tax. And they had to decide, now who's going to make up that tax loss, that lost revenue? And the decision was made that it was fair for the business community to replace that gold mine revenue. And so the business community stepped up and did so. But I think there was an understanding there that if ever the shoe was on the other foot and the business community was hurting and industry was, declining, and there were other sources of tax revenue coming from this business sector, which the government has lumped in with us, and the hospital, therefore, is a part of the commercial side of the equation. If that ever happened, then maybe there should be a conversation about reducing those mill rates to get back to what was considered fair before. I guess the question is, how did we get to this point now where it seems more fair to increase taxes on the small business community every time there's an assessment? And it's up to council to decide what's fair and what strategically you want to do and whether or not you think the small business community deserves that support.
Great, thank you. And a chance to respond?
Yeah, I was just wondering, so for the follow-up is like, has the chamber had a discussion about what their definition of small business is in Yellowknife?
Yeah, we haven't. We've, debated it a little bit. We've got our own membership categories that would require some more engagement, I think, from the city of Yellowknife. I don't know if board members want to jump in on that.
Yeah, I think like there's comparable models like Bonnyville and place we looked at, but because we have such a very skewed ownership structure here, like when it comes around the tax asset, being heavy on government and heavy on like large corporations like REITs, and then there's a lot of small owners. I think it would need a unique way of solving that. I don't know what that is, but yeah, it's not like Edmonton where it's majority private sector owned buildings and a couple government. Here it's massive private sector, massive amount of government, and then a few small owners. So yeah, I don't know what the solution is, but it would take a unique lens to define what kind of hit those different lines.
And then just to echo as well, certainly the Yellowknife Chamber is willing to engage with the city of Yellowknife and certainly our membership as well to determine what the most effective model to ensure that small businesses are getting some tax relief. I saw Adrian hand up there, so I'll hand it over to you.
Yes, thanks. Just briefly, I think, some of these questions about have we done this analysis or that analysis, I think for a small nonprofit, I think our hope, and I won't speak for everybody, but it would be to present ideas and see if they're good ones, see if there are some examples elsewhere, but really, we don't have the resources to do an in-depth analysis and nor the consultation that would be required to do this. But if council likes an idea like this, you have a taxation division, you've got an economic development department division, so that we would hope that analysis would be done in the future if the idea has support and is seen to have merit.
So Adrian, maybe I'd sort of jump in for a quick second there. So I actually brought this up or something similar to this to administration when we first started our term on council. I had a desire to want to spur development by putting a different taxation policy on vacant land and undeveloped land within the city municipal boundary, and then also extending that to taking a look at a different government rate, so that the biggest landowners and those ones that are those profit centers for us, we can really maximize that generation. And we know that that's a client that's stagnant, that's staying put, and then being able to tier the taxation to a business community as a different rate. Now, I've been told from administration that that this isn't possible under our current legislation. So I'm just curious, if anybody from administration would like to pipe in just with the perspective from themselves on when council has been bringing interesting ways of doing taxation up to them.
Yeah, I think Sherilyn or Sheila could touch on that. PATA, the Property Assessment and Taxation Act, does have some differences when it compares Alberta versus Quebec versus all the other communities, but there is some room to look at property classes, and so if Sherilyn or Sheila want to jump in to elaborate on that point.
Thanks very much, Mayor Welty, and thanks, Councillor Williams. Yeah, we always appreciate hearing from councillors, and much like we like hearing from the chamber as well on ideas, that we do like to go back and explore and see what's viable around this. The proportion between business and residential tax has been something that we look at quite a bit. We have done adjustments after general rate assessment changes to make sure that we can adjust the hit that happens. I will ask Sherilyn to speak this. She's quite knowledgeable on this and has managed this strategically for us under council's broad direction. Thanks.
Thank you for the opportunity to, I guess, give a little background on this. The comments so far have been full of good ideas and obviously something that people need to put a lot of thought into. So I guess when we talk about the mill rates, really they're just a way to distribute responsibility for the property tax owners. And as the mayor alluded to, the Property Assessment and Taxation Act, it does give the city the authority to create property classes. Our tax administration bylaw did just that back in 1995. It set out 6 classes based on predominant property use. So essentially what we do is when council approves the budget, it determines how much revenue has to be raised from property taxation. We use the mill rates to distribute that. So if we distribute it more heavily on one end, the other end gets a break and vice versa. When we look at that in the context of the assessment base, we do see that the specific mill rates that distribute the taxes among that assessment base, they do change from year to year, but in the 25 years since our current classes were implemented, we see that the only time there's been anything other than just very, very minor tweaks in the adjustment between the commercial and residential mill rate has been in respect or in response to a general assessment, where that general assessment has considerably shifted the composition of the assessment base. The most recent time we had this happen was just in 2019, when we had a significant growth in the GNWT portion of the commercial base. That new hospital made that grow by almost 95%. So essentially then what administration does, we look at the revenue requirements, we look at our assessment base, and we bring forward mill rates in May. As part of that process, we're always looking at what's going on in other jurisdictions, doing some comparisons as much as we can relative to what services are provided by property taxes, because of course those vary from municipality to municipality. But after our last general assessment in advance of the 2019 mill rates, we did a really thorough analysis. We brought that forward, basically asking council, you know, here's a recommendation that will kind of mitigate the impacts of that assessment base. And the philosophical decision and direction that was provided at that time was for a very minor adjustment. So I guess it's very important to remember too, that if we adjust in one area, one goes up, the other goes down. It's all part of that budgeting balancing act. I think I addressed some of the questions.
What about within a category? So in a business category, of commercial category, are there opportunities for tiers within that category?
Not within the legislation. If we were to say take business and divide it into large and small, we would have to introduce, by way of a bylaw, new property classes. The assessor would then have to reassess every property in that class to decide which of the new classes it would go in, and then council would, at mill rate time, assign mill rates based on those classes. Of course, every time there is a change or every time we do a general assessment, those would be revisited. So you'd be looking at every 5 years unless extra effort was put into maintaining that assessment classification or almost subclass, as it were.
Great, thank you. Well, on that note, I'll refer back to our submission then that the mill rate ratio between commercial and residential property taxes has increased 23.5% since 2012 up until 2020. So certainly how administration and council are choosing to distribute that tax burden, we have some recommendations that we've put forward to make sure that there's more engagement within the business community as well, so that you know, if that ratio is going up, there must be consultation with stakeholders such as the Yellowknife Chamber. We're also recommending that consultation on mill rates happen at the same time as budget consultations. If you're not following council and municipal politics heavily, businesses may miss the opportunity to provide feedback. And we're also recommending that information about the property tax implications for each mill rate class is included in budget communications. We are aware of the online budget calculator, but actually seeing that displayed and communicated in budget documents will make it easier for businesses to understand their property tax implications. At this point, I saw that Julian had a question, so I'll hand it over to him.
Thanks, Deneen. And sorry if this point was covered already, but I just wanted to make sure to clarify it if it hasn't been. Does the chamber have data on how many of their members who are small businesses? I mean, I assume the chamber is predominantly small business, but how many of those small businesses are renting from larger commercial properties? Because I guess my only concern, and I'm wondering if the chamber did this kind of analysis, but if we ended up changing the mill rates to favor small business, I'm just curious how big of a percentage of those small businesses actually own property, even pay direct tax directly, because some of the, if they're renting from a larger commercial operator whose tax rate actually ends up going up, we could be kind of inadvertently actually increasing costs for small businesses. I know most of the businesses downtown, for example, are renting their properties from someone else. And so I'm just curious, I wonder if the chamber's thought about whether a tax incentive is really the best way to do it, or if there's some other way to get around this. Like, I don't know about a rent subsidy. I mean, that doesn't sound like something that the city could do, but I'm very interested in this idea. I agree that, you know, supporting small business is the target that we want to make. I've got no problem charging companies like Walmart through the nose, to be quite frank about it, and would love to see, you know, small local businesses that we really want to see opening, that are helping to revitalize the downtown, helping us achieve our goals and objectives as a community. I'd love to see us supporting those more. So if we can find a way to do that fairly, that doesn't overly negatively impact other people or cause inadvertent impacts, because I think a lot of those small businesses may not actually own property. So I'm curious to know if you guys have kind of done that level of analysis. I know Adrian was mentioning that as a small organization, you might not have the capacity to do that, but I'm just curious about that.
Well, I can confirm that the Yellowknife Chamber does primarily represent very small businesses. Our biggest category is those under 10 employees, but certainly, you know, our members are all over the board, including some of the large, you know, franchises as well. I will see if one of my board members would like to respond to that.
Sure, Deneen, I'm happy to respond to that. So thanks for the question, Councillor Morse. So no, we haven't done the analysis, and I guess I echo what Adrian says, is that if this is an idea that the city's wants to pursue and finds interesting, then we'd be happy to work with the city in order to do the analysis and how best to apply the different property tax class. And I agree, I take your point. There's going to be a lot of small businesses that rent from bigger businesses who may be swept up in a larger tax bracket. And that is certainly something that we would want to avoid. It would defeat the purpose. So recognizing that, I'm not sure how we would define the category. Obviously, it would have to be quite nuanced, echoing what Rob says. You know, the ownership structure for properties in town in Yellowknife is quite different than what you would see in comparable municipalities down south. So it would take, to use Rob's word, a very specific lens in order to make sure that that tax category is properly targeted. Adrian?
If I could just ask a quick follow-up question. Sorry to interrupt, Adrian. I guess the next question is then, if a majority of your business, I mean, I feel like it wouldn't be too hard to figure out how many of them are renting. If so many of them are renting, then they're kind of paying taxes. I guess they're paying secondary tax is the best way I could think of putting it. They are paying taxes through their rent, but the taxes is ultimately charged to the landlord. I'm wondering if you guys know of other chambers or other kind of municipalities that, considering that situation, have different kinds of systems other than just taxation. Just to tack on an additional question, but curious to also hear what Adrian.
Thanks for the question, Julian. Oh, sorry, Deneen. I don't want to interrupt.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I don't have that information offhand, but can certainly look into other models from other chambers and circulate that and hand it off to you, Adrian.
Thanks. I think as many chambers as there are in the country, that's exactly how many different models you're going to find. And Tim mentioned it, it really would come down to the nuances of the bylaw, but no one tool is perfect, to be certain. And Julian, I think you mentioned a couple, different ideas there for providing other sorts of support. If there are small businesses that are missed or that are that aren't really adequately helped by this, then yes, you've got other means at your disposal. You've got a revitalization reserve with $2.4 million in it and a downtown reserve with $800,000 or so in it, neither of which has really been used in a long time. There used to be grant programs attached to these so that those funds, which, at least the downtown one was created with that in mind. It was not just to collect, parking meter revenue, it was to give it back. And it's been a long time since a really good mechanism has been found to do that and to really make a difference. So certainly, Julian, I think this would be one of many tools that can be used. But and I mean, I was there on council when, with each passing year, we failed to come up with a way to really do this, and that problem persists. But I think this council, thanks in part to the interest you've shown in small business and in business in general, but also the great taxation growth, incredible growth that you've had from $28 million to $35 million in only, 3 tax years, that puts you in a position to come up with some programs. And I think, I don't want to speak for the chamber. I know we have talked about this, but we would be more than happy to sit down and come up with a dozen ideas for how you could get some of those funds back into the hands of business owners and tenants, but also, for the revenues that they generate to reduce their expenditures. But yeah, lots of different tools out there. So I, for one, would be very happy to participate in further discussions about this.
Great, thank you. At this point, we're going to hand it over actually back to Mayor Alty, just to give us some historical context on mill rate approval in the spring versus at budget. Of course, our recommendation is that the two occur together in the fall, but we'd like to hear some historical context on that.
For sure. And I'll hand it over to Sheila and Sherilyn to explain that part, but just to I'll hand it over to them right away and then elaborate after that. Sheila or Sherilyn, if you want to touch on why mill rate approval happens in the spring versus at budget time.
Thanks, Sherilyn. You're our expert on this.
Thank you. Yeah, so even though council approves the budget in December, it doesn't approve the final mill rates until about May. And that is because we need to wait until the final assessment roll is in place. So assessment notices do go out in January, but by the time we allow for assessment questions, complaints, and the legislated Board of Revision process, and then any changes that come out of that Board of Revision need to be made, we're looking at the early spring, April, May, in order to know exactly what that bottom line is on the assessment base. So we're, in a sense, legislated to wait for that assessment roll, hence the delay or separation of the two. Thanks.
Great, and now I'll open it up to any of my board members who would like to respond to that.
I was just going to give an example for 2020. So when we adopted the budget 2020 in December of 2019, administration estimated that a tax increase of 1.63% would be needed to meet the tax revenue requirement for the year. And then the assessment roll value was finalized, and there were some changes made by the Board of Revisions, which actually resulted in a decrease in assessed values on some commercial properties. And with those changes, it actually meant that a tax rate of 1.78% was going to be required in order to match the tax revenues, because again, municipalities have to have a balanced budget at the end of the year. But given the COVID-19 impacts, administration recommended that the tax rate increase remain at just 1.63%. And so that difference of the $58,000 revenue just came from our general fund balance as opposed to doing that tax increase. So again, just that that example of it happens more than you think of when we approve the budget in December, the assessments happen in January, properties can be reassessed, and come spring, we actually have to adjust the tax increase. Whether it's an increase or decrease, the city generally goes in favor of the taxes, and we'll look at the general fund balance to make up any of those differences. But just a bit more information there as an example.
Great, thank you. I'll give it an opportunity for board members to respond, and then perhaps we'll move on to the reserve funds. Oh yeah, Adrian, go ahead.
Thanks. I absolutely understand that there are some adjustments that are made. I think they're very, very minor in terms of the total taxation and all the assessments that are out there. Having been on the Board of Revision for a couple of years where we had 7, appeals type of thing. So I do think it's possible to project, even if it's not final, to project what the numbers are going to look like. Just for the councillors who aren't familiar with this problem, the difficulty is that the entire business community and every resident were focused on the budget at a certain time, and that's in December. And then what happens 6 months later when there's a mill rate discussion and a council decides, okay, we need to change the revenue, which categories we take it from, no one's paying attention. And I think if the business community in the past, in those years when the business community has had, these increases over and above the other categories, had they been there for that conversation, that had happened in December, I think there would have been a lot of frustrated business owners. And so if you have the conversation in December as part of the budget debate and say, look, yes, we may have to make adjustments in 6 months' time, but we're going to make them equally, evenly, fairly across all categories. We're going to keep the ratios fixed. That's a conversation you could have in subsequent years. And you could even adopt that as a budget policy, that it's going to be fixed. The objective is to make it fixed after perhaps an adjustment at this time to kind of bring things back in line to where they were before. You could then set that in policy. But the important thing is to have the conversation at the same time, because, I know how this goes. Nobody is paying attention in May. And so it's quite simple to just get a little bit extra money from the business community. The press isn't reporting on it. As far as everyone else is concerned, all the decisions were made 6 months earlier. So I do think there's merit in having a conversation in December with the other budget deliberations.
And again, our recommendation is for, a budget policy. So again, ensuring mill rate ratios can only be changed after consultation with stakeholders, that those consultations are happening at the same time as budget consultations, as Adrian just spoke to, and that the information about those property tax implications for each mill rate class are included in budget communications. Before we move on, I saw that Councillor Julian Morse had a question, so we'll hand it over to him.
Yep. Thanks, Deneen. I was just going to maybe suggest, I think that this, as Adrian had noted, it's not even the time that we're dealing with mill rates. And I would suggest that this is a big enough discussion that we could certainly meet with the chamber about this again, not at budget time, and really focus on it as a topic just for one meeting or even more. But one thing I wanted to kind of encourage people to think about is, if we can get information from the chamber that would be valuable. I find that often in the conversation about taxation, something that gets lost on me as a homeowner, and I want to be 100% clear, I don't own a business or operate a business in the downtown, so I don't know what it's like directly for businesses. That's what you guys are giving me information on. But as a homeowner, taxes are not the biggest concern that I have. We talk about taxes a lot, but if we were to adjust mill rates here or there, maybe it'll result in maybe $100 a year increase, a couple $100 a year. It's not something that I actually notice on the month to month. So the one thing I do want to be careful about and have the chamber think about as they're advocating towards us is, what is really the thing that's impacting businesses the most? If it's taxes, if it's taxation, then absolutely let's talk about it. And if the city can do things that will make a big difference. But if we go through this huge exercise, have administration do a lot of research and use our resources to do that, and it results in some businesses getting a couple $100 a year off their tax bill, is that really going to be the make or break for them? Is that going to be a big deal? I want to ensure that when we're spending time thinking about how we can help small business, that we're really thinking about the things that affect them the most, and that we're ensuring that whatever incentive programs or whatever we come up with to help small business, because I am really interested in having that conversation, and I am interested, if we can, in setting policy that helps achieve that goal. But I want to make sure that what we're doing gets the biggest bang for buck. And so if the small adjustment of mill rates, I have concern that it may not actually really have the impact that we're hoping to have. So just want to put that out there. If I'm completely off the mark and completely wrong, totally open to hearing that as well. So thanks.
Thanks, Julian. Rob, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I'll just give a personal example. So my office I'm in right now, 3% tax increase means that my bill goes up by $2,900 a year. So an average homeowner doesn't notice because their tax rate's so low, but when you get large commercial buildings, the actual dollar amount is very substantial. This is why it matters. So, because then I got to recover that money from my tenants, right? So when we say apply evenly, it's in real dollar amounts. It's a lot more dollars for a business just because the amount we're taxed at, right? So you don't notice as a homeowner if it goes 3%, you're like, oh, $50 a year, whatever the number is. But I sure notice as a business owner because that's like thousands of dollars it changes mine. So just think, when you think about the change, think about maybe more in dollar amounts than percentages, because the dollar amount matters a lot on this end.
Great, thank you. Were there further questions from either council or my board before we move into a discussion on reserve funds? Seeing none. So as part of our submission, we mentioned how the City of Yellowknife has a $10.039 million in reserve funds, including $877,000 in the Downtown Development Reserve and $2.416 million in the Revitalization Initiative Reserve. Our ask is for council to deploy these funds as soon as possible. And we suggest one option could be preparing an investment package that includes things like tax incentives, land, and financial contributions to start preparing the City of Yellowknife for the upcoming Polytechnic University. Adrian, I saw a hand up there.
Sorry, no, I thought we were skipping over the land fund conversation, that I'd somehow missed it. Sorry, the reserve fund conversation. Please proceed.
We're in the thick of it. So perhaps I'll hand it over to you, Mayor Alty. I know you mentioned in the comments there that you'd like to speak about the reserves.
Yeah, thank you. And again, I really appreciate your letter and the suggestions. And when we're asking questions like, you know, do you guys have a definition on small business? It's just because I'm interested to know how far you've gone, or whether we need to like explore that together more. And same with, you know, the tax implications and mill rates and stuff like that. So for the reserves, yes, we do have some funding in those too. We recently had our, what was it called? The recommendations for our response to our university feasibility study. And in that we identified incentives for it to increase student housing, as well as looking at the opportunity to encourage the GNWT to have more of a campus presence here in Yellowknife. And the upcoming consultations I wanted to flag we're currently in the process of doing the zoning bylaw review, because we approved our community plan at the end of July. Following the zoning bylaw approval will be our development incentive bylaw review. And that's where we'll be looking to incentivize development to encourage aligning with the policies and principles that we approved in the community plan. So, you know, funds in these reserves are one tool that we'll be able to use to support the development incentive bylaw to be able to fund those projects. So definitely encourage the chamber to think of some ideas and participate in that discussion when that bylaw review comes forward. Because at the same time as it sounds like a lot of money, when you actually start talking about projects, it can be not a lot of money. So, you know, there's, yeah, I've heard a few different recommendations on, you know, the city should do this and that. And I'm like, well, that's over $1 million, or that's over $2 million. And the only way that the city can borrow money is by going to a referendum, do we think that the public's going to support the city borrowing money to do that project? So yeah, welcome the discussion with the chamber as we do the development incentive bylaw review, and we will be looking to talk to the GNWT about incentives regarding the Polytechnic, as well as doing those development incentives for not only like student housing, but affordable housing, which was identified as something that we should consider in our 10-year plan to end homelessness, is that incentive and toolbox the city can encourage affordable housing developments.
Great. I'll open it up to my board members to see if anyone would like to respond or comment further on the reserve funds. Seeing none, then I will, oh, Adrian there. I'll reiterate as well that at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, we established the Business Resilience Working Group and came up with a number of recommendations. And at that point in time, we were also encouraging the city to look at some of those reserve funds. So certainly, you know, an important expenditure and investment into our community, and you know, our members are looking to see some movement in some of these initiatives pretty quickly. A lot of things have been, you know, studied multiple times, and so I think the time now is to take some action. Adrian, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Deneen. I appreciate it. Sorry, Mayor Alty, I'm just trying to understand. You're saying that suggestions for how to use those reserve funds will be left to a bylaw review process? Is that what you're suggesting?
No, that can be one. Like if we're doing the development incentive bylaw review, there will be need to actually have funds to support those incentives. So the reserves could be used then. The other thing was, and I don't know if Ms. Bassi-Kellett or Ms. Penny could speak to all the number of downtown and retail revitalization studies, putting a full implementation plan together. Funds may be needed from those reserves to support those projects. So there's a few moving pieces, but the development incentive bylaw review will need funds, and this may be one area where we could get the funds. But there's other areas like capital budget items or projects that are proposed through those various downtown development plans.
I see. Okay, thank you. I mean, I think, yeah, that putting some money behind it, some sort of downtown revitalization implementation plan would be great. I mean, but again, these are things, you know, the time is now, and it would be wonderful to see some progress on some of these things. And I think that's why the chamber has put this forward. It's that, you know, it's year after year of this money sitting there. And we've been, you know, super thrilled, or I certainly have, I think we all have, to see the GNWT propose a reduction in the small business tax rate. I mean, that was something that it was in the mandate for a period of time. They moved on it. They got it done. It came along at the right time for sure. It maybe was in the works for longer than it may have appeared. But, you know, what's in the works at the city level? I mean, this money is sitting there, and there's a fairness conversation about, you know, piling up these reserves in the first place. And if the idea is to kind of make it easier to borrow money in the future because these can be used towards big capital projects, well, then there's a fairness conversation there as well. You know, I do think there's a generational conversation about who should be paying for new facilities. Should it be the people who were parking downtown 8 years ago, whose money is sitting in that fund, or should it be the people who are going to use these facilities in the future? I think the most important thing is to just, you know, get this money working for the community and towards our economic development, and assisting all, you know, small business community and Yellowknifers as a result of deploying those dollars.
Great, thank you. Rob, I see you're unmuted.
Yeah, so you say you are working on an implementation plan, kind of where is that at? I guess Mayor Alty, just starting or yeah, kind of where's that at, I guess?
Sheila, do you have an update on that one?
Sure, thanks very much, Mayor Alty. So a couple of things. As Mayor Alty pointed out, we've been working on the zoning bylaw, which comes after our community plan. We have a 6-month window that we need to complete that. The community plan was approved end of July. We're pushing really hard to have the zoning bylaw done by March, so we'll be maybe 7 months in. Then comes the development incentive bylaw, which is a really important one, which we are really looking at the overall funds and how we can be utilizing those to really incentivize development in the downtown. The other one that we're working on right now is an implementation for the vision for downtown revitalization. It's been around for a while. We've had a number of different strategies that have come together, including our retail revitalization strategy, the THEA report that we're a group of consultants that we had brought together who have planning expertise to give us some big picture recommendations. We know our recent economic development strategy that was finalized in February for 2020 to 2024. So putting all of these together, along with the foundation that's created by the community plan, is something that we're looking at. And so we've got a couple of specific projects under that we're expecting to come to council early in the new year that are really going to start the ball rolling on that. So you will see some things happening in the new year. Thank you. Well, I'll just see if Carrie has anything to add to that.
Thanks, Sheila. No, I think you covered it really well. We're busily working in the background and expect to bring forward some initiatives in the next 6 to 8 weeks. So stay tuned. And changes to these, for example, the Revitalization Initiative Reserve, that's specifically targeted toward land assemblies. So any changes to that will have to go through council as well anyway. So there will be public discussion and debate about these things at some point because they have been established for a specific purpose. So, and that's it.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I'm glad it's only 6 to 8 weeks to hear something, but yeah, I think time is of the essence here. So as much as Chamber can help you work on those and get those deployed so we can stop talking about doing stuff and do some stuff, I'm yeah, excited to hear that. So, thanks.
Yeah, just to echo what Rob said as well, you know, the city and the chamber have a really great working relationship, and so we're very eager to collaborate and work with you on those. Just being mindful of the time here, with 5 minutes left, I wanted to open it up for just general Q&A. If board members have questions for council, maybe we'll deal with those right away, and then the opposite, council can ask any last minute questions that folks have. All right, seeing none, do any councillors have any last questions for our board of directors? Robin, I see your hand up.
Thank you, Janine. Yeah, just wanted to touch base on the last point of the letter, which was the External Finance Committee. So like the idea on the surface, though, the one thing that I think that we'd run into challenges on is just how much time it would take for administration. So do you feel, you know, how administratively heavy? Because again, when you're getting into the inner workings of the city, you likely need some input from administration on those. And then how do you see this in being more beneficial than just simply having an opportunity to give feedback to council and the SAO? Because, you know, again, it's primarily the SIO's decision on you know, the structure of the organization, and certainly, you know, when you say cost cutting, you know, or you know, operational efficiencies, that can sometimes mean jobs, things along those lines. So I'm just sort of curious about how you're framing it. As like, you know, we as council don't generally get into the nitty gritty as saying, you know, you have this employee here and this employee there. We empower the SAO to have some broad level policy, and then it's her execution of the operation itself. So just sort of curious and just a little bit more detail in what you're envisioning here, because I think that, yeah, this is something that I certainly am been asking from administration is there opportunities to do some savings? Where do we find those without it becoming sort of an exercise in austerity?
Thanks, Robin. Do any board members want to take a stab at that? Yeah, Adrian, go ahead.
Thanks, Deneen, and thanks for the question, Robin. Just to, first of all, to point out that there was actually a committee like this, and I'm not sure how many years it was in place, but it was under Mayor Van Tighem, I believe, or perhaps Mayor Lovell. And I think if you talk to some of those councillors from back then, I think they'll say that it was very, very helpful. And perhaps it's not a full-time, you know, committee that's there forever, but certainly a task force for a few years And I think the value in that past committee was that you had finance, public finance experts, which councillors aren't, members of the Chamber of Commerce aren't necessarily. Certainly there are exceptions in both cases, but typically it requires a certain level of expertise. And you know how hard it is for a councillor to wrap their head around how the budget works. And I mean, and we have quite a very transparent budget process, but it's still, it's very specialized expertise. So you can get a group of people together for a few years to look, say, and it's not necessarily about austerity. There's a big difference between austerity and just restraining growth, which if you take a look at the city's track record for quite a while, there's been a certain amount of just annual growth, nothing crazy, but over time, you know, it adds up. It's all incremental, just like the mill rate changes. And so every so often, I think it's worth striking such a task force, getting some experts in a room. And I was very briefly in the past, I was on the audit committee, and I know there are a bunch of people who joined the audit committee because they thought it would present that opportunity. There were experts in that room and they wanted to be able to comment on some great ideas for how the city could, you know, evolve in the future and kind of maybe focus on some core areas, outsource a couple of service areas here and there. And who knows? I mean, it's up to council to act on those things in collaboration with the SAO. So it would have to make sense, but it's an opportunity to get some ideas and to get the conversation going. And it certainly doesn't have to be something that's in place for 20 years looking over the shoulder of administration and council.
Don't want to take up too much time because I know that we're running short, but you're very aware, I'm sure, of the new task force, Mayor's Task Force on Economic Development. You know, I think that some of the initiative, or I guess the precipice behind this to get this thing going was some of these things. Do you see maybe us opening the scope of that, and does the mayor want to talk about her experience with this, working with this task force, and is that part of the mandate?
I have to jump off. I have a meeting at 1, but I think they would be two different. But council is in the process of reviewing all of our committees and determining if the right committees are in place to do the work that we need right now. So when we have the committee discussion in the new year and sorting out which committees should stay, whether there should be committees added, I think this is something for councillors to consider.
I'd be very interested in having that conversation with you, Adrian, offline. So we'll connect sometime, maybe just after Christmas when we're having this discussion.
Great, thank you. And just to be mindful of everyone's time, we are at 1 o'clock here. I saw that Julian had a comment, so I'll hand it over to him and then we'll wrap up.
Thanks. I really just wanted to thank the Chamber for their advocacy and for taking the time to talk to us. I won't introduce another topic because we all have work to do. So thanks very much, you guys. Always appreciate the hard work the Chamber does advocating for small business in the community. It's important.
Great. Well, thank you once again to Mayor Alty, Council and Administration for joining us for today's public meeting. As I mentioned, this is recorded and will be available online later this afternoon. And we look forward to having future meetings with Council. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, you guys.